The August heat clung to Savannah like a second skin, suffocating and inescapable. The year was 1852, and the city's cobblestone streets rippled with humid distortion as the morning sun climbed higher above the moss-draped oaks. Eleanor Blackwood dabbed her forehead with a lace handkerchief, while her carriage jolted along the uneven road toward the courthouse. Through the curtained window, she watched the grand homes of the wealthy plantation owners give way to more modest structures, then to the market where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. "Nearly there, Miss Blackwood," her driver called back, his voice tight with the strain of the journey. Eleanor nodded, though he couldn't see her. At 32, she had never expected to find herself the mistress of Magnolia Hill Plantation. When her father passed 3 years earlier, leaving her the sole heir to one of Georgia's most prosperous cotton plantations, whispers had started immediately. How could a woman, unmarried and childless, possibly manage such an estate? The question lingered in every sideways glance, in every conversation that fell silent when she entered a room. What those whispers didn't account for was Samuel. Samuel Johnson had been her father's most trusted slave, educated secretly by Eleanor's mother before her death. He could read, write, and calculate figures better than most white men in the county. After her father's death, it was Samuel who had truly managed the plantation's day-to-day operations, while Eleanor maintained the facade of control. And now they were both facing the gallows. The courthouse loomed ahead, its white columns stark against the blue Georgia sky. Already a crowd had gathered, men in suits and hats, women with parasols, children running between adults' legs, street vendors hawking cool drinks and fans to combat the oppressive heat. All of them here to witness the spectacle, the trial of Eleanor Blackwood and Samuel Johnson. The charges: miscegenation, fraudulent marriage, and violation of the slave codes of Georgia. Their crime, according to the indictment, a secret marriage performed 3 months ago by an itinerant preacher who didn't realize Samuel was enslaved. When discovered, the scandal had rocked Savannah society to its core. "Ready yourself, miss," her lawyer, James Thornton, murmured from across the carriage. "They're out for blood today." Eleanor straightened her back, the whalebone corset digging into her ribs. "They've been out for blood since the day my father left Magnolia Hill to me instead of my cousin." Thornton's expression darkened. "Your cousin Richard is leading the charge against you. He claims you've gone mad with grief, that you've sullied the Blackwood name." "He wants my plantation," Eleanor replied coldly. "Nothing more, nothing less." The carriage came to a halt, and a moment later the door swung open. The cacophony of the crowd washed over her, jeers, curious murmurs, and outright hostility. Eleanor stepped down, her black mourning dress, worn not for her father now, but for the life she was watching crumble, sweeping the dusty street. "Make way!" Thornton shouted, taking her elbow and guiding her through the throng. "Make way for Miss Blackwood!" Someone spat at her feet. Another called out, "Nigger lover!" The words cut through the air like a whip. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, her face a mask of composure. Inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. She had not seen Samuel since their arrest 2 weeks ago. They had been separated immediately. She to house arrest at Magnolia Hill, with a guard posted at her door. He to the slave quarters of the county jail, where conditions were said to be brutal. As they approached the courthouse steps, the crowd parted slightly, revealing a second carriage arriving. From it emerged Eleanor's cousin, Richard Blackwood, flanked by his wife and the district attorney, Howard Coleman. Richard, tall, broad-shouldered, with the same dark hair and blue eyes that marked all the Blackwoods, caught Eleanor's gaze. His lips curled into a cold smile. "Cousin," he called out loud enough for those nearby to hear, "not too late to come to your senses. Admit your indiscretion was a moment of madness. The courts might show mercy." Eleanor didn't respond, but Thornton muttered under his breath, "Don't engage. He's trying to provoke you in front of witnesses." Inside the courthouse, the air was marginally cooler but thick with tension. Every bench was filled, with people standing along the walls. Eleanor was led to a table at the front, where she sat beside Thornton. The district attorney took his place at the adjacent table, arranging papers with methodical precision. And then a side door opened, and Samuel was brought in. Eleanor's composure nearly broke at the sight of him. His normally immaculate appearance had deteriorated. His face was gaunt, his clothes ragged. A bruise darkened his left cheekbone, and his wrists were raw from manacles. Yet when his dark eyes met hers, they held the same quiet dignity they always had. "All rise for the Honourable Judge William Hartley," the bailiff called. As the judge took his seat, Eleanor caught sight of the newspaper on a nearby gentleman's lap. The headline screamed, "Blackwood heiress defiles Southern honour with Negro husband." Judge Hartley, a man well into his 60s with a shock of white hair and piercing grey eyes, surveyed the courtroom. "Let it be known," he began, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the room, "that this court will maintain order. Any disruptions will result in immediate removal." He turned his attention to the district attorney. "Mr. Coleman, you may begin." Coleman stood, adjusting his waistcoat. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of Savannah, today we bear witness to one of the most egregious violations of our sacred way of life. Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of the respected late Jonathan Blackwood, has not only engaged in the immoral act of miscegenation with her slave, Samuel Johnson, but has mockingly formalized this abomination through a fraudulent marriage ceremony." He paced before the jury box, where 12 white men sat in judgment. "The evidence will show that Miss Blackwood, perhaps unhinged by grief after her father's passing, developed an unnatural attachment to this slave. Witnesses will testify that she elevated him to a position no Negro should occupy, allowing him to dine in her home, to read books from her library, to act as though he were her equal rather than her property." And Eleanor felt the weight of every stare in the courtroom. The accusation was correct, of course. She had done all those things and more. She had loved Samuel Johnson for years, quietly, secretly, impossibly. Furthermore, Coleman continued, "We will demonstrate that on the night of May 15th, Miss Blackwood and the slave Samuel traveled to the county line where they encountered a traveling preacher, one Reverend Thomas Miller, who, unaware of Samuel's status, performed a marriage ceremony. This act not only violates our state's miscegenation laws, but constitutes a fraudulent contract, as a slave cannot enter into legal agreements." Coleman turned, pointing directly at Eleanor. "The prosecution will prove that Eleanor Blackwood knew exactly what she was doing, that she deliberately concealed Samuel's identity as her slave, that she willfully violated the laws and customs of Georgia, and that she has, through these actions, brought shame upon her family name and our entire community." As Coleman resumed his seat, Thornton squeezed Eleanor's hand beneath the table. "Stay strong," he whispered. "My turn now." Thornton rose slowly, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the wooden floor. "Your Honor, members of the jury, my esteemed colleague has painted quite a picture of moral depravity, of laws broken, of social order upended. But what if I told you that this case is not about miscegenation or fraudulent contracts at all?" He paused, allowing his words to settle in the hushed courtroom. "This case, gentlemen, is about property, not the property that Samuel Johnson supposedly is, but the property that Eleanor Blackwood rightfully owns. Magnolia Hill Plantation, one of the most profitable estates in all of Georgia, passed to Miss Blackwood upon her father's death, bypassing his nephew, Richard Blackwood." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Thornton gestured toward him. "And now, 3 years later, when it has become abundantly clear that Miss Blackwood is more than capable of managing her inheritance, when Magnolia Hill's profits have increased by 15% under her stewardship, suddenly there are accusations that she has lost her mind, that she must be stripped of her property, both Magnolia Hill and, yes, legally, Samuel Johnson as well." Thornton approached the jury box. "The defense will show that Miss Blackwood has been the victim of a calculated scheme to discredit her, to declare her unfit, and to transfer her considerable wealth and property to her cousin." We will demonstrate that the so-called marriage was nothing more than a prayer ceremony, a blessing between two Christians, witnessed by no one but the preacher himself, who conveniently has since left the state and cannot be called to testify." From the gallery came a low murmur. Thornton had struck a chord. In a society built on property rights, the suggestion that a man might scheme to take a woman's inheritance resonated. "Finally," Thornton concluded, "we will prove that Miss Blackwood, whatever her personal feelings toward her slave might be, has maintained the proper social order at Magnolia Hill. Samuel Johnson may have been educated, may have been trusted with responsibilities beyond those of an ordinary field hand, but at no time did Miss Blackwood publicly treat him as anything other than what Georgia law declares him to be, her property." As Thornton returned to his seat, Judge Hartley leaned forward. "Mr. Coleman, call your first witness. The state calls Richard Blackwood to the stand." Richard stood, straightening his jacket as he approached the witness box. After being sworn in, he settled into the chair, his posture relaxed, confident. Coleman began methodically. "Mr. Blackwood, what is your relationship to the defendant?" "Eleanor is my first cousin. Her father, Jonathan, was my uncle." "And were you close to your uncle before his passing?" Richard nodded solemnly. "Very. Uncle Jonathan was like a second father to me after my own passed. I spent summers at Magnolia Hill as a boy, and as an adult, he often consulted me on plantation matters. Did you expect to inherit Magnolia Hill upon his death?" Richard hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Eleanor. It was disgust. Uncle Jonathan had concerns about Eleanor's ability to manage such a large estate alone, being unmarried and, well, a woman. Coleman nodded understandingly. "And how would you characterize your cousin's behavior after her father's death?" "Increasingly erratic," Richard replied, his voice heavy with apparent concern. "At first, I attributed it to grief. But as time passed, her behavior became more concerning. She withdrew from society, declined invitations, rarely left Magnolia Hill except for necessary business." "And what about her relationship with the slave, Samuel Johnson?" Richard's expression darkened. Uncle Jonathan had always treated Samuel differently, educated him to help with accounts and such. But Eleanor, she took it much further. "I visited once and found Samuel sitting at the dining table with her, eating from the family china. When I objected, she dismissed me from her home." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Even in households where trusted slaves held privileged positions, dining at the master's table crossed a line few could comprehend. "And how did you become aware of the alleged marriage?" Richard leaned forward. "One of Eleanor's house slaves, Bessie, came to me in distress. She told me that Miss Eleanor and Samuel had gone away one night and returned with Samuel moved into the main house, not as a servant, but as—" He paused dramatically. "A husband." Coleman paced thoughtfully. "And what actions did you take upon learning this information?" "I confronted Eleanor immediately, for her own protection, you understand. Such a scandal could ruin her completely. She didn't deny it. She told me to mind my own affairs, that Magnolia Hill was hers to run as she saw fit." Richard shook his head, the picture of familial concern. "That's when I knew I had no choice but to involve the authorities. This wasn't merely about impropriety. It was about Eleanor's mental state. No sane woman of her breeding would make such a choice." The testimony continued for another hour, with Richard painting a detailed picture of Eleanor's supposed decline. When Coleman finally said, "No further questions," Judge Hartley looked to Thornton. "Your witness, Counselor." Thornton rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. "Mr. Blackwood, you testified that you spent summers at Magnolia Hill as a boy. How old were you when these visits ended?" Richard frowned slightly. "Around 16, I suppose." "And why did they end?" "I began working for my father's shipping business. I had less free time." Thornton nodded. "Is it possible that your uncle stopped inviting you because of an incident involving one of his female slaves?" Richard's face flushed. "Objection," Coleman called out. "Counsel is making insinuations without foundation." "Your Honor," Thornton responded calmly, "I'm establishing Mr. Blackwood's character and his relationship with his uncle, which he himself brought into testimony." Judge Hartley considered this. "I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Thornton." Thornton turned back to Richard. "Let me rephrase. Mr. Blackwood, were you ever disciplined by your uncle for mistreating any of his slaves?" Richard's jaw tightened. "My uncle and I had disagreements about plantation management. He was softer than my father in his methods." "Softer," Thornton repeated. "Is that how you would characterize not whipping a 14-year-old girl for breaking a teacup?" Richard's knuckles whitened as he gripped the rail of the witness box. "That slave was being deliberately insolent. Discipline is necessary." "And did your uncle see it that way?" "No," Richard admitted grudgingly. "In fact," Thornton pressed, "your uncle told you never to set foot on Magnolia Hill again, didn't he?" He was angry. "He later invited me back for holidays. Yet in your earlier testimony, you claimed to be very close to your uncle, that he consulted you on plantation matters. Which is it, Mr. Blackwood?" Richard glared. "People reconcile, Mr. Thornton." Thornton changed tack. "Let's discuss your financial situation, Mr. Blackwood. Is it true that your shipping business has suffered significant losses in the past 2 years?" "Objection." Coleman was on his feet again. "Relevance?" "Your Honor," Thornton replied, "Mr. Blackwood's financial interests are directly relevant to his motives in this case." Judge Hartley nodded. "Overruled. The witness will answer." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "The entire shipping industry has faced challenges. My business is sound." "So sound that you've mortgaged your own home twice in the past year?" Thornton produced a document. "I have here public records from the county registrar showing liens against your property totaling $15,000. A gasp ran through the courtroom. It was an enormous sum. "Meanwhile," Thornton continued, "Magnolia Hill's cotton production last year yielded profits of over $20,000, a substantial sum that would solve your financial troubles overnight, if only it were yours instead of your cousin's." "I object to this characterization." Richard's voice rose. "I brought this matter to light out of concern for Eleanor and for the proper order of society." "Did you?" Thornton asked mildly. "Then perhaps you can explain why, 2 months before reporting this alleged marriage, you approached Miss Blackwood's bank with a letter claiming she was mentally unfit and attempting to gain control of her accounts. A letter the bank manager rejected for lack of evidence." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hartley banged his gavel. "Order!" Richard's face had gone from flushed to pale. "I was concerned about her judgment." "Your Honor," Thornton said, "I would like to enter into evidence this affidavit from Mr. Harold Green, manager of the First Bank of Savannah, detailing Mr. Blackwood's attempt to gain control of Miss Blackwood's finances prior to any knowledge of an improper relationship with her slave." As the document was handed to the judge, Thornton turned back to Richard. "One final question, Mr. Blackwood. The slave who informed you of this marriage, Bessie, I believe you called her. Can you describe her to the court?" Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "Her appearance, age, height, distinguishing features." "She's a Negro woman. Middle-aged, I suppose." Thornton nodded. "Thank you. No further questions." As Richard stepped down, visibly shaken, Thornton leaned close to Eleanor. "He's never met Bessie," he whispered. "There is no Bessie at Magnolia Hill." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "My lady's maid is named Martha." Thornton nodded. "Exactly. He's lying." Coleman called several more witnesses, neighbors who had observed Eleanor's growing isolation, a store clerk who had seen Samuel driving Eleanor's carriage alone, a former tutor who testified to Eleanor's romantic temperament and impressionable nature. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom had grown stifling. Ladies fanned themselves vigorously while gentlemen mopped their brows. Judge Hartley called for a short recess before the prosecution's final witness. In a small antechamber, Eleanor sank into a chair, accepting the glass of water Thornton offered her. "You're holding up admirably," he said quietly. "Will they call Samuel to testify?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thornton shook his head. "As a slave, he cannot testify against a white person in court. It's one of the few advantages we have." He hesitated. "Eleanor, there's something I must ask. The marriage was real," she finished for him. "The preacher knew exactly who Samuel was. He performed the ceremony anyway, said that in God's eyes all men are equal." Her fingers trembled around the glass. "But you can continue to deny it. The preacher has indeed left the state. I made sure of it." Thornton looked pained. "Do you understand what's at stake here? If convicted, you face imprisonment. Samuel faces execution." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I understand perfectly. That's why I've instructed you to defend us by any means necessary." When court resumed, Coleman called his final witness, Dr. Elias Montgomery, a physician specializing in female disorders. "Dr. Montgomery," Coleman began, "in your professional opinion, can grief affect a woman's mental faculties?" The doctor stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Most certainly. The female mind is naturally more delicate than the male's, more susceptible to emotional disturbances. Prolonged grief can lead to hysteria, melancholia, even forms of temporary insanity. And could such a condition cause a woman to form unnatural attachments? To persons beneath her station, for instance?" "Absolutely. In my practice, I've observed bereaved women becoming inappropriately attached to servants, pets, even inanimate objects. The mind, seeking comfort, latches onto whatever is near." Eleanor felt her face burning with anger as the doctor continued to expound on the supposed weaknesses of the female mind. Beside her, Samuel sat utterly still, his expression unreadable. When Coleman finished, Thornton approached the witness stand with deliberate slowness. "Dr. Montgomery, have you ever examined Miss Blackwood professionally?" "No, sir." "Have you observed her behavior firsthand at any time since her father's death?" "I have not had that opportunity." "So, your testimony about her mental state is purely hypothetical?" The doctor bristled. "It is based on my extensive experience with similar cases." "Similar cases," Thornton echoed. "Have you treated many wealthy plantation mistresses who have allegedly married their slaves?" Scattered laughter rippled through the courtroom. The doctor's face reddened. "No, but—" "No further questions," Thornton said, cutting him off. Coleman stood. "The prosecution rests, Your Honor." Judge Hartley nodded. "Mr. Thornton, call your first witness. The defense calls Martha Wilson to the stand." A slim black woman in a neat dress and head wrap approached. After being sworn in, a rare occurrence for a slave testifying in a southern court, she sat rigidly in the witness chair. "Martha," Thornton began gently, "how long have you worked at Magnolia Hill?" "All my life, sir. I was born there. I'm 43 years old now." "And what is your position?" "I'm Miss Eleanor's personal maid. Have been since she was a little girl." "Do you know a slave named Bessie who works at Magnolia Hill?" Martha frowned. "No, sir. No Bessie at Magnolia. Not in my lifetime." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Richard Blackwood shifted in his seat. "Martha, in your position, you would be intimately familiar with Miss Eleanor's daily routines and private affairs, would you not?" "Yes, sir. I dress her, do her hair, attend to her personal needs. Have you ever observed any behavior that would suggest Miss Eleanor was romantically involved with the slave Samuel Johnson?" Martha's expression remained neutral. "No, sir. Miss Eleanor has always been proper. Samuel runs the plantation business for her, keeps the accounts, oversees the other slaves. She treats him with respect because he's educated and good at his work. Nothing more. Were you aware of any trip Miss Eleanor and Samuel took on the night of May 15th? "Yes, sir. Miss Eleanor had business in Savannah with her cotton broker. Samuel drove her there and back. They returned late that night. Did Samuel's living arrangements change after that night?" "No, sir. Samuel has always lived in the overseer's cabin, separate from the other slaves, but not in the main house." Thornton nodded. Thank you, Martha. No further questions. Coleman approached, his expression skeptical. Martha, you are Miss Blackwood's slave, are you not? Yes, sir. And if she were found guilty and her property confiscated, what would happen to you? Martha's eyes flickered briefly. I suppose I'd be sold, sir. So you have every reason to protect your mistress, don't you? To ensure your own comfortable position continues. Martha met his gaze directly. I have reason to tell the truth, sir. I've been a God-fearing woman all my life. Coleman changed tactics. Have you ever seen Miss Blackwood treat Samuel differently from other slaves on the plantation? A moment's hesitation. Samuel is different, sir. He can read and write. Miss Eleanor's mother taught him when he was a boy, with old master's permission. He does different work. But does Miss Blackwood treat him as a slave or as something else? Martha's face remained impassive. Miss Eleanor treats everyone with kindness, sir. That's her way. But Samuel knows his place. After several more unsuccessful attempts to trip Martha up, Coleman dismissed her with evident frustration. Thornton called his next witness, Harold Green, the bank manager who had rebuffed Richard's attempt to seize Eleanor's accounts. Green, a portly man with spectacles and a pocket watch chain stretched across his substantial belly, confirmed Thornton's earlier assertions. Richard Blackwood had indeed approached the bank 2 months before the alleged marriage, claiming Eleanor was mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. I rejected his claims, Green stated firmly. Having dealt with Miss Blackwood regularly on plantation business, I found her to be exceptionally astute in financial matters. Magnolia Hill's accounts are impeccably maintained, better than most managed by men, if I may be so bold. By the time Thornton called his third witness, a neighboring plantation owner who testified to Eleanor's sound business practices and the plantation's increased productivity under her management, the courtroom's atmosphere had subtly shifted. The initial certainty of Eleanor's guilt had given way to doubt, particularly regarding Richard's motives. Judge Hartley checked the time. We'll adjourn for today and resume tomorrow morning with the remaining defense witnesses. Court dismissed. The bang of his gavel echoed through the room. As the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor caught Samuel's eye one last time before guards led him away. His expression conveyed a message only she could read: hope. The second day of the trial dawned with rain, a rare respite from the relentless Georgia heat. Droplets streaked the carriage windows as Eleanor made her way to the courthouse. The streets turned to mud. The usual crowd of spectators diminished but still present, huddled beneath umbrellas and store awnings. Inside, the courtroom was humid, the rain having done little to cool the air, but much to increase its oppressiveness. Eleanor took her seat beside Thornton, watching as Samuel was once again brought in, his appearance no better than the day before. When his eyes met hers, she forced herself not to react, mindful of the many gazes fixed upon them both. Judge Hartley called the court to order promptly at 9 o'clock. Mr. Thornton, you may call your next witness. The defense calls Reverend Charles Bedford. A tall, thin man with a clerical collar approached the witness stand. After being sworn in, he sat with the rigid posture of one accustomed to pulpits and pronouncements. Reverend Bedford, Thornton began, how long have you known Miss Eleanor Blackwood? Since she was a child. I was her father's pastor at First Presbyterian Church here in Savannah for over 30 years. And would you describe Miss Blackwood as a religious woman? Deeply so. Even after her father's passing, when many in grief might turn from God, Eleanor's faith only strengthened. She attends services every Sunday without fail, contributes generously to church missions, and has even established a small chapel at Magnolia Hill for the spiritual instruction of her slaves. Thornton nodded. In your pastoral capacity, have you had occasion to counsel Miss Blackwood since her father's death? Yes, regularly. She sought guidance in managing her grief and in understanding her new responsibilities. And during these counseling sessions, did Miss Blackwood ever express romantic feelings toward her slave, Samuel Johnson? The Reverend's expression remained solemn. Never. She spoke of him only as a trusted servant who helped her maintain her father's legacy. Eleanor understands the natural order established by God. Reverend Bedford, are you familiar with a traveling preacher named Thomas Miller who may have passed through this region in May of this year? Yes, indeed. Reverend Miller stayed at our church for several days. He's a Methodist circuit rider who travels throughout Georgia and South Carolina, ministering to rural communities without established churches. Did Reverend Miller mention performing any ceremony for Miss Blackwood? Bedford hesitated, glancing toward Eleanor. He did. He told me that Miss Blackwood had asked him to perform a blessing ceremony at Magnolia Hill, a prayer service for the plantation's continued prosperity. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Thornton pressed on. Not a marriage ceremony? Certainly not. Reverend Miller made no mention of marriage. He described it as a simple blessing, with Miss Blackwood and her overseer Samuel present to represent the plantation's management. Coleman rose. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. The Reverend is testifying to what another person allegedly told him. Judge Hartley considered this. While technically hearsay, I'll allow it given the circumstances, the absence of Reverend Miller himself. However, the jury will give it the appropriate weight, understanding it is not first-hand testimony. Thornton continued. Reverend Bedford, in your professional opinion, as a man of God who has known Eleanor Blackwood her entire life, do you believe she would violate the laws of Georgia and the teachings of the church by entering into a forbidden marriage? I do not, Bedford replied firmly. Eleanor Blackwood is a woman of principle and faith. Whatever ceremony occurred that night, I'm confident it was not what Mr. Blackwood has alleged. When Thornton finished, Coleman approached the witness, his expression skeptical. Reverend Bedford, you testified that Miss Blackwood established a chapel at Magnolia Hill for the spiritual instruction of her slaves. Who conducts these services? Bedford shifted slightly. Various ministers from town rotate the duty. I myself go once a month. Is Samuel Johnson ever permitted to lead these services? Another hesitation. Occasionally I understand he reads scripture when no white minister is available. With supervision, of course. Coleman raised his eyebrows. So Miss Blackwood allows her slave to preach to other slaves, to interpret the word of God, not to preach or interpret, merely to read the text, Bedford clarified, though he looked uncomfortable. Many plantations have similar arrangements when ministers cannot be present. Perhaps, Coleman conceded, but is it common for slave women to sit in the front pews while white visitors must sit in the back? Bedford's face flushed. I am not aware of any such arrangement. Coleman produced a letter. Your Honor, I'd like to enter this into evidence. It's a letter from Mrs. Agatha Hemphill to her sister in Charleston, describing her shock at the seating arrangements she observed when visiting Magnolia Hill's Sunday service 3 months ago. As the letter was handed to the judge, Coleman turned back to Bedford. Reverend, would such an inversion of the proper order be consistent with your understanding of Miss Blackwood's character? Bedford's composure faltered. If this occurred, and I cannot say it did, as I wasn't present, it would be unusual. But Eleanor has always had a charitable heart toward her slaves' spiritual welfare. Charitable enough to blur the distinctions God himself established between the races. Objection, Thornton called. Counsel is making theological assertions, not asking questions. Sustained, Judge Hartley ruled. Mr. Coleman, confine yourself to factual inquiries. Coleman nodded. Reverend Bedford, one final question. In your pastoral conversations with Miss Blackwood, did she ever express dissatisfaction with the institution of slavery itself? Bedford's eyes darted toward Eleanor, then back to Coleman. Eleanor, like many thoughtful Christians, has wrestled with reconciling human bondage with Christian brotherhood, but she has never advocated for abolition or expressed radical views. Thank you, Reverend. No further questions. As Bedford stepped down, looking troubled, Eleanor leaned toward Thornton. Mrs. Hemphill's letter. That incident happened exactly as she described it. I didn't think anyone had taken notice. Thornton sighed. The prosecution has been thorough in building their case against you. Let's hope our final witness can undo some of the damage. The defense calls Dr. William Harper to the stand, Thornton announced. A distinguished-looking man in his 50s approached. After being sworn in, he introduced himself as a physician who had served many of Savannah's prominent families for over 20 years. Dr. Harper, Thornton began, you've been Miss Blackwood's physician since she was a young woman, is that correct? Yes, for nearly 15 years now. And have you had occasion to treat her since her father's death 3 years ago? I have. I attended her during a brief illness last winter, and I see her regularly for general health consultations. In your professional opinion, has Miss Blackwood shown any signs of mental instability, hysteria, or melancholia during this time, Doctor? Harper shook his head firmly. None whatsoever. Miss Blackwood has always impressed me with her composure, clarity of thought, and practical approach to matters of health, both her own and that of her slaves. So you would disagree with Dr. Montgomery's assertion that grief might have unbalanced her mind? I would. While grief certainly affects everyone, Miss Blackwood has handled her father's passing with remarkable strength. If anything, she's become more focused, more determined in her management of her affairs. Thornton nodded. Thank you, Doctor. No further questions. Coleman rose slowly. Dr. Harper, you testified that you treat not only Miss Blackwood but her slaves as well. Yes. Miss Blackwood is unusual in that she calls a physician for slave illnesses rather than relying solely on home remedies or slave healers. And do you treat the slave, Samuel Johnson? I have, yes, for a fever last autumn. Where did this treatment take place? Dr. Harper hesitated. In the main house. Miss Blackwood had him moved to a guest bedroom during his illness to facilitate my visits. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A guest bedroom, Coleman repeated. Not the slave quarters? Not even the overseer's cabin where he supposedly lives? It was a serious fever. The accommodations in the slave hospital weren't suitable for his recovery. Coleman's expression was skeptical. And did other sick slaves receive similar accommodations in the main house? Not to my knowledge. Just one more question, Doctor. In your professional interactions with Miss Blackwood and Samuel Johnson, did you observe anything unusual in the way they related to one another? Dr. Harper hesitated again, longer this time. They have a rapport based on mutual respect. Samuel is educated, articulate. Miss Blackwood consults him on plantation matters. It's unusual, yes, but not unprecedented among more progressive planters. Progressive, Coleman echoed. An interesting choice of word, Doctor. No further questions. Judge Hartley looked to Thornton. Any redirect, Counselor? Thornton shook his head. No, Your Honor. Does the defense have any further witnesses? Just one, Your Honor. The defense calls Miss Eleanor Blackwood. Yep. A hushed anticipation fell over the courtroom as Eleanor rose and made her way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, she arranged her black skirts and faced the room with quiet dignity. Thornton approached. Miss Blackwood, for the record, please state your full name and age. Eleanor Margaret Blackwood. I am 32 years old. Oh, Miss Blackwood, did you enter into a marriage with your slave, Samuel Johnson, on the night of May 15th of this year? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I did not. Reverend Miller performed a blessing ceremony for Magnolia Hill as he testified to Reverend Bedford. Samuel was present as the plantation's overseer, representing the workers whose labor makes our success possible. Why would your cousin, Richard Blackwood, claim otherwise? As you've demonstrated through bank records and witness testimony, Richard has been attempting to gain control of Magnolia Hill since my father's death. When his financial manipulations failed, he resorted to attacking my character and mental fitness. Thornton nodded. Several witnesses have testified to the unusual position Samuel Johnson occupies at Magnolia Hill. Can you explain the nature of his role? Eleanor's expression remained composed. My father recognized Samuel's intelligence from an early age. My mother taught him to read and write, and my father trained him in plantation management with the intention that he would serve as an overseer. When father died, I simply continued this arrangement. Samuel manages the day-to-day operations, keeps the accounts, and oversees the other slaves. His education and abilities make him invaluable to Magnolia Hill's success. And is there any romantic attachment between you? None, Eleanor replied firmly. Our relationship is that of employer and trusted employee, nothing more. Thank you, Miss Blackwood. No further questions. Coleman approached, his expression calculating. Miss Blackwood, you claim that Samuel Johnson lives in the overseer's cabin, not in the main house. Is that correct? Yes, that is his residence. Yet Dr. Harper testified that during an illness you moved Samuel to a guest bedroom in your home. Why would you do that for a slave? Samuel's value to the plantation is considerable. His illness was serious, potentially fatal. I would have done the same for any overseer, slave, or free. Would you? Coleman pressed. Dr. Harper indicated that other slaves were not given similar accommodation when ill. The others have the slave hospital. As overseer, Samuel occupies a position between the field hands and the house staff. Coleman changed tack. Miss Blackwood, do you believe in the natural inferiority of the Negro race? Thornton stood. Objection. Miss Blackwood's personal beliefs about race are not on trial here. Your Honor, Coleman countered, Miss Blackwood's views on race are directly relevant to establishing motive for the alleged marriage. Judge Hartley considered this. I'll allow it. The witness will answer. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly in her lap. I believe that all human beings are children of God, Mr. Coleman. Beyond that, I find that individuals vary greatly in their capabilities and character, regardless of race. A murmur ran through the courtroom. It was not the answer expected of a Southern lady of property. Coleman's eyes narrowed. So you reject the biblical and scientific basis for the institution of slavery? I did not say that, Eleanor replied carefully. I merely observe that God creates diversity within all his creations. Samuel Johnson is intelligent and capable. Other slaves at Magnolia Hill have different strengths. I manage my plantation according to these realities. Let's be more direct, Miss Blackwood. Have you ever expressed sympathy for the abolitionist cause? No, I have not. Have you ever purchased reading materials from Northern publishers known for their anti-slavery views? Eleanor hesitated, just briefly enough to be noticeable. I subscribe to several literary journals, some of which may occasionally publish authors with diverse political views. I read for intellectual stimulation, not political guidance. Coleman produced a ledger. Your Honor, this is a record from Harrington's bookshop showing Miss Blackwood's purchases over the past 2 years. They include works by Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and William Lloyd Garrison, all notorious abolitionists. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hartley banged his gavel. Order! Eleanor's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure. I read widely, Mr. Coleman. Understanding all perspectives on an issue is not the same as endorsing them. Perhaps, Coleman conceded, but it establishes a pattern of sympathy that makes the alleged marriage more plausible, doesn't it? Before Eleanor could answer, Coleman produced another document. Miss Blackwood, do you recognize this? She glanced at the paper, her expression faltering for the first time. It appears to be a letter in my handwriting. Indeed, a letter you wrote to your aunt in Boston last year. Would you read the marked passage aloud for the court? Eleanor took the letter with trembling fingers. Sometimes I wonder if Father knew the burden he was placing on my shoulders, not merely the management of Magnolia Hill, but the moral weight of owning other human beings. There are moments, Aunt Margaret, when I look at them, especially the children, and cannot reconcile my Christian conscience with their bondage. Samuel understands my struggle. We often discuss a future where... Her voice faltered. Please continue, Miss Blackwood, Coleman pressed. A future where things might be different, not just at Magnolia Hill, but throughout the South. Eleanor handed the letter back, her face ashen. Coleman looked triumphant. A future where things might be different, where the natural order is overturned. Where women marry their slaves, perhaps. He didn't wait for her response. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Hartley looked to Thornton. Redirect, Counselor. Thornton approached quickly. Miss Blackwood, in this letter to your aunt, were you advocating for immediate abolition? No, Eleanor replied, regaining some composure. I was expressing the moral complexity many thoughtful Southerners feel. The letter continues, though Mr. Coleman didn't have me read further, to discuss gradual approaches to improving conditions while maintaining economic stability. And these discussions with Samuel about a future where things might be different, did they involve romantic plans between you? Absolutely not. We discussed practical matters, education for slave children, improved housing, medical care, changes that would benefit Magnolia Hill's productivity while acknowledging our slaves' humanity. Thornton nodded. No further questions, Your Honor. The defense rests, Thornton announced. Judge Hartley glanced at the clock. We'll break for lunch, then hear closing arguments. A court dismissed until 1 o'clock. As the spectators filed out, Eleanor remained seated, feeling the weight of every stare, every whispered comment. The trial was no longer merely about an alleged forbidden marriage. It had become something larger, a referendum on the very foundations of Southern society. And she knew with sudden clarity that regardless of the verdict, nothing would ever be the same again. The afternoon session began in a courtroom so packed that people stood along the walls, craning their necks to see. The morning's rain had stopped, leaving behind a sticky humidity that made collars wilt and foreheads glisten. Judge Hartley called for order, then turned to the prosecution. Mr. Coleman, your closing argument. Coleman approached the jury slowly, his expression grave. Gentlemen of the jury, over the past 2 days, you have heard testimony that paints a disturbing picture. A picture of a woman who, whatever her initial virtues may have been, has allowed grief and isolation to corrupt her judgment and morality to the point where she now threatens the very fabric of our society. He began to pace, his voice rising. The defense would have you believe this case is merely about property, about a greedy cousin seeking to steal an inheritance. But I ask you, what property is more precious than the social order that underpins our way of life? What inheritance more valuable than the traditions and hierarchies that separate civilization from chaos? Coleman gestured toward Eleanor. Miss Blackwood sits before you, a woman of breeding and education, who has systematically dismantled every boundary that should exist between master and slave. She has educated her slave, Samuel, beyond any practical necessity. She has elevated him to dine at her table. She has moved him into her home during illness. She has allowed him to lead religious services. She has discussed with him a future where things might be different, a phrase so laden with dangerous implications that it scarcely needs elaboration. He turned to face the jury directly. And yes, gentlemen, I believe the evidence shows conclusively that Eleanor Blackwood did indeed enter into a mockery of marriage with her slave. The defense claims it was merely a blessing ceremony, but consider, why would such a ceremony need to be conducted in secret, at the county line, by a traveling preacher who conveniently cannot be called to testify? Why not have Reverend Bedford, her family's pastor for 30 years, perform this innocent blessing? Coleman shook his head solemnly. The answer is clear. Because no respectable Georgia minister would participate in what Miss Blackwood truly intended, a union that violates not only our state's laws, but God's natural order. He approached the jury box, his voice lowering to an intimate tone. Gentlemen, you have a solemn duty today, not merely to render judgment in a criminal case, but to defend our way of life against those who would undermine it from within. Eleanor Blackwood may not carry the banner of abolition openly, but her actions speak louder than words. By elevating her slave to the position of near equality, or worse, intimate companionship, she strikes at the very foundation upon which our society is built. Coleman straightened. The prosecution has proven beyond reasonable doubt that Eleanor Blackwood, whether through mental instability or moral corruption, has violated the miscegenation laws of Georgia and attempted to formalize that violation through a fraudulent marriage ceremony. The law demands a guilty verdict. Justice demands it. The preservation of our way of life demands it. He returned to his seat amid murmurs from the gallery. Judge Hartley turned to the defense table. "Mr. Thornton, your closing argument." Thornton rose slowly, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the courtroom floor. He approached the jury with measured steps. "Gentlemen of the jury, Mr. Coleman has spoken passionately about our social order, about tradition, about the way of life we all value. And in doing so, he has revealed the true nature of this case. It is not about a marriage at all, but about fear." Thornton paused, allowing his words to settle in the hushed courtroom. Fear that a woman might successfully manage a plantation without a husband. Fear that a slave might demonstrate intelligence and capability that challenge comfortable assumptions about natural inferiority. Fear that someone within our midst might question, even privately, the moral implications of an institution we have long taken for granted. He gestured toward Eleanor. "Eleanor Blackwood has committed no crime. She has maintained a profitable plantation, continued her family's legacy, and treated her property, yes, her human property, with a Christian kindness that reflects well on her character rather than diminishing it." Thornton approached the jury box. "The prosecution asks why Miss Blackwood would seek a blessing ceremony from a traveling preacher rather than her family pastor. The answer is simple. Reverend Miller was already at Magnolia Hill, ministering to the outlying slave cabins that Reverend Bedford rarely visits. It was a matter of convenience, not secrecy." He turned, gesturing toward Richard Blackwood in the gallery. "Meanwhile, we have established clear motive for these accusations. Richard Blackwood faces financial ruin. His shipping business falters while Magnolia Hill prospers under his cousin's management. His previous attempts to gain control of Eleanor's finances failed. Only by having her declared mentally unfit or criminally deviant can he hope to claim what his uncle deliberately did not leave to him." Thornton's voice hardened. "Consider the evidence, gentlemen. The prosecution's case rests on the testimony of a man with $15,000 of debt and a demonstrated history of attempting to seize his cousin's property. It relies on a house slave who doesn't exist, on a marriage ceremony with no witnesses, on interpretations of private correspondence that twist expressions of moral reflection into evidence of criminal intent." He approached the jury again, his expression earnest. "The defense, by contrast, has presented testimony from people who know Eleanor Blackwood intimately, her physician, her pastor, her personal maid. All confirm that while Miss Blackwood may manage her plantation differently than some, she maintains the proper social order and has shown no signs of the mental instability claimed by her cousin." Thornton's voice softened. "Gentlemen, this case asks you to determine not just the facts of a single night in May, but the character of a woman who stands before you, accused of the most serious breach of social propriety. I submit to you that Eleanor Blackwood is guilty not of miscegenation or fraud, but of independence in a society uncomfortable with female autonomy, of thoughtfulness in a time that prefers unquestioning acceptance, of kindness in a system that often rewards cruelty." He stepped back, his final words ringing through the courtroom. "The law requires proof beyond reasonable doubt to convict. The prosecution has offered you speculation, insinuation, and the testimony of a man who stands to gain enormously from his cousin's downfall. I ask you to return the only verdict the evidence truly supports: not guilty on all charges." As Thornton returned to his seat, Judge Hartley addressed the jury. "Gentlemen, you have heard the evidence and arguments in this case. You must now determine whether the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Eleanor Blackwood violated George's miscegenation laws by entering into a marriage with her slave, Samuel Johnson, and that she committed fraud in doing so. He continued with detailed instructions on the legal standards they must apply, the possible verdicts they might reach, and their responsibilities as jurors. Finally, he dismissed them to begin their deliberations. "Court is adjourned until the jury reaches a verdict," he announced, bringing down his gavel. The waiting began. Eleanor was escorted to a small antechamber where she sat with Thornton, neither speaking much as the hours passed. Through the window, she watched the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the courthouse lawn. "What will happen to Samuel if I'm found guilty?" she asked finally, breaking the long silence. Thornton's expression was grim. "The punishment for a slave who marries or attempts to marry a white woman is death, Eleanor, usually by hanging." She closed her eyes briefly, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "And for me, imprisonment most likely, 1 to 5 years. And of course, you would be declared mentally unfit to manage your affairs. Richard would almost certainly be appointed as your guardian and take control of Magnolia Hill." "So either way he wins," Eleanor said softly. Thornton shook his head. "Not if the jury acquits you. There's still hope, Eleanor." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. The bailiff entered. "They've reached a verdict." The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor took her place at the defense table. Samuel was brought in, his expression resolute despite the visible toll of his imprisonment. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Judge Hartley called the court to order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a grey-haired merchant named Thomas Wilson, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of violating George's miscegenation laws, how do you find?" Wilson hesitated, his eyes briefly meeting Eleanor's before returning to the paper in his hand. "Not guilty, Your Honor." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Eleanor felt a wave of dizzying relief. "On the charge of fraudulent marriage, how do you find?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and outraged cries. Judge Hartley banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order in this court." When the noise subsided, he turned to Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood, you have been acquitted of all charges. You are free to go." He then addressed Samuel. "As the charges against Miss Blackwood have been dismissed, the corresponding charges against the slave Samuel Johnson are similarly dismissed. He is to be returned to Miss Blackwood's custody immediately." Eleanor rose on unsteady legs, accepting Thornton's supportive arm. Across the room, she saw Richard's face twisted with rage, his wife attempting to calm him as he gesticulated furiously to Coleman. "It's over," Thornton murmured. "You've won." But as Eleanor left the courthouse, stepping into the warm evening air, where a crowd had gathered to hear the verdict, she understood that nothing was truly over. The whispers would continue. The suspicions would linger. Savannah society would never fully accept her again, and in truth, she no longer wanted their acceptance. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood on the deck of the steamship Augusta, watching as Savannah's harbour receded in the distance. Beside her, Samuel, no longer Johnson but Freeman, having been granted his freedom in a quiet ceremony the day after the trial, stood with squared shoulders, his gaze fixed on the horizon ahead rather than the shoreline behind. "Are you certain, Eleanor?" he asked quietly. It was the first time he had used her given name in public, though in private it had been on his lips for years. She nodded. "Magnolia Hill is sold. The money is safely deposited in a Boston bank. Martha and the others who wish to come north have been freed and are traveling separately to avoid suspicion." She took his hand, no longer caring who might see. "There is nothing left for us in Georgia. And what awaits us in Boston?" Samuel's voice held both hope and apprehension. Eleanor squeezed his hand. "My aunt's home initially. Then perhaps we'll travel further, to Canada or even England, places where we can live openly, as husband and wife." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "We already are," she replied softly. whatever the court decided. Whatever society believes, in God's eyes and in our hearts, we have been joined since that night in May. As the shoreline of Georgia disappeared into the gathering dusk, Eleanor felt not loss, but liberation. The trial that had been meant to destroy her had instead set her free from Magnolia Hill, from the burden of owning other human beings, from a society built on hierarchies she could no longer accept. Ahead lay uncertainty, prejudice of a different kind, struggles she could scarcely imagine. But beside her stood the man she loved, and before them stretched an open sea of possibility. For the first time since her father's death, Eleanor Blackwood felt truly at peace. In Boston, 6 months later, Eleanor sat at a small desk in her aunt's parlor, penning a letter to James Thornton. The winter sunlight streamed through the window, catching the simple gold band on her left hand, a ring that now held legal meaning in Massachusetts, if not in her native Georgia. "My dear Mr. Thornton," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. Samuel and I have settled into life in Boston with surprising ease. Though we face curiosity and occasional hostility, we have also found community among abolitionists and reformers who welcome us as living testimony to the possibility of a different future for our divided nation. I sometimes think of the trial and of Richard's face when the verdict was read. I have heard through Aunt Margaret that Magnolia Hill does not prosper under his management as it did under mine. The slaves, sensing his desperation, work without the diligence they once showed when treated with basic dignity. Perhaps this, too, is a kind of justice. I write not merely to share news of our well-being, but to thank you once again for your courage in defending us. You risked your reputation, and perhaps your practice, to stand for truth, when it would have been easier to bow to prejudice. For this, you have my eternal gratitude. Samuel has begun teaching at a small school for freed slaves, while I work with the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. We speak sometimes of the homeland we left behind, its beauty and its contradictions, the warmth of its sun and the coldness of its institutions. We pray for a day when all of God's children might live in freedom there. Until then, we build our life here one day at a time, testament to the truth that love recognizes no boundaries of race or station, and that freedom, once tasted, becomes the only air worth breathing. With deepest regards, Eleanor Freeman. She signed the letter, watching as the ink dried on the page. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting Boston's rooftops with white. So different from Georgia's heat, from Magnolia Hill's sprawling acres, from the life she had once thought would be her only future. Samuel entered the room, moving to stand behind her chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noting her pensive expression. Eleanor covered his hand with hers. "About journeys," she replied. "About how the path to freedom is rarely straight or simple. About how sometimes a trial meant to condemn can instead become the means of liberation." Samuel nodded, understanding as he always did. "And about how the story continues beyond the verdict." "Yes," Eleanor said, rising to stand beside him at the window, watching the snow transform the world outside. "Always continuing, always unfolding, one page at a time." Together they stood in silence, free citizens in a nation still grappling with the meaning of freedom, their joined hands a quiet defiance of the boundaries that had sought to separate them, their shared life a testament to the power of love to overcome even the most entrenched divisions of their time. Outside, Boston continued its winter day, unaware of the small revolution taking place within its bounds, not of armies or proclamations, but of two hearts who had dared to claim the freedom to love across the artificial barriers of a divided nation. Their story, like so many others, would someday form part of the long, complex tapestry of America's journey toward fulfilling its founding promise, that all people are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For Eleanor and Samuel, that pursuit had begun in a Georgia courtroom, and would continue through all the days of their lives. a quiet revolution, one heartbeat at a time.